We're going to have our first presentation today. After that, we will again take a short break where we'll have coffee down in the room at the end of the hallway. Let's welcome our first presenter. This is Professor Ilana Snyder from Monash University. She's published several books you may be familiar with, including Hypertext, Page to Screen. Today she's going to be talking about curation, how it's transformed, changed, been affected by new media, social media. So let's welcome her.
Okay, curation. In March this year, I went to the Adelaide Festival of the Arts for a long weekend. At the Gallery of South Australia, the Turner exhibition was touted as the premier art show at the festival, an opportunity to experience the iconic paintings of J.M.W. Turner, who lived from 1775 to 1851, one of Britain's greatest artists. The exhibition was titled Turner from the Tate and the Making of a Master. It comprised over 100 works, oil paintings, watercolours and sketches, some of which have never been exhibited before, probably for very good reason. The exhibition was co-curated by Ian Worrell, Tate London and Jane Messenger Art Gallery in South Australia. The most notable feature of the curation was its conservatism. It traced Turner's trajectory from boyhood to death, a chronological survey showing his evolution from a precocious 13-year-old to a great painter of nature's light, colour and atmosphere. Now this work, Disaster at Sea, painted around 1833, captures the shipwreck of a convict vessel bound for Botany Bay, Australia. All 125 women and children on board were lost in a violent storm off the coast of France. An inquiry established that the captain didn't lower his lifeboats and refused help from the French Coast Guard, claiming that he wasn't authorised to land his cargo until its destination. A perfect choice for an exhibition in a former British colony that resonates with contemporary politics about refugees in Australia. Now, in each room, there were the mandatory wall texts that provided contextual information about the period and about Turner's life. Each painting was also accompanied by a wall label, sometimes just the date, when it was painted and the collection to which it belonged, with sometimes more information about the painting. There was also a video about Turner showing in a small space just before you reach the merchandise section. And the curation was unobtrusive, predictable, familiar, what we've become used to since the mid-20th century, comfortable rather than challenging for viewers. Now, in December 2012, I caught the Francis Bacon 5 Decades exhibition at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. This was curated by freelance British curator Anthony Bond. Bacon's described in the online promotional material as a towering figure of 20th century art whose paintings are gutsy, controversial and unforgettable. And with painful beauty, he lays bare the struggles of the human condition. 50 paintings covers the 5 decades of his career, from the pensive and shocking works of the 1940s to the exuberantly coloured and visceral large paintings of the 70s and 80s. Shown alongside the paintings was a wealth of archival material from his small London studio. Examples of vast amounts of visual information, photographs of friends, pages from magazines, art journals, newspapers and film posters with which Bacon surrounded himself. As Bacon said, I work much better in chaos. Chaos, for me, breeds images. Now, like the Turner exhibition, the Bacon also used chronology to sequence the paintings, but decade by decade. Glass display cases contained the resources, and that's the word that was used, that offered a fascinating insight into the artist and his creative processes. The video that accompanied the exhibition, again located in a room adjacent to the merchandise section, focused on the curation of the paintings and artefacts. The aim was to expose the processes that the team engaged in to produce the exhibition. Now back to Melbourne. In 2013 in March, I visited an exhibition of French-American artist Louise Bourgeois, her late works at the Heidi Museum of Modern Art. Now, the museum comprises 3 main buildings. The newest, built in the 60s, is where the Bourgeois pieces were installed, while the house built in the 50s is where an associated exhibition was located. Curated by Jason Smith, the Bourgeois exhibition of over 20 works focused on the final years of her career and looked at her use of fabric in sculpture and drawing. Louise Bourgeois was an inventive, provocative and influential artist. As the online and print promotional material for the exhibition told potential visitors, She was the founder of what's known as confessional art. Her biographical stories provided inspiration for her work. Her parents' tapestry workshop, where she learned the value of art as a form of reparation, her father's infidelity, her mother's betrayal, an early death, her sense of abandonment, her constant analysis of self, her belief in art as a way to exorcise demons and reconcile with the past. Now, in this exhibition, the curator's intervention in shaping the meanings that visitors might make of the works was much more evident than with the Turner exhibition. The wall texts and labels overlaid the exhibition with deeply psychological interpretations of the work. Now, the associated exhibition, curated by Linda Michael and the Wonderful 60s House, showed curation as a flight of fancy, but one informed by a deep knowledge of contemporary Australian art. The exhibition, this is the house, the exhibition looked at relationships both real and imagined between bourgeois art and that of 10 Australian artists. Now, some of the artists included such famous ones as Patricia Piccinini, and they paid direct homage, I hope you can recall that earlier image, to bourgeois' work or consider similar themes, while others connect on a more psychological level. As a curator explains, bourgeois' oeuvre inspired several of the Australian artists to use personal subject matter as a creative source at a time when a cool, detached conceptualism dominated. And now to the fourth and last exhibition. And one is what I'm doing, I hope that it's going to become clear. I want to tell you about another one at the Adelaide Festival in March. And it was a suite of installations by US artist Laurie Anderson. It was at the Anne and Gordon Sandsteg Museum of Art, and it was titled Laurie Anderson, The Language of the Future, Selected Works, 1971 to 2013. Now, Laurie Anderson, as you all know, creates in a variety of media. She's invented musical instruments, published books, released albums, exhibited at major museums, and she's curated festivals. The Adelaide exhibition was the result of, quote, curatorial discussion between David Sefton and Lucy Guster of the Adelaide Festival and Erica Green and Gillian Brown at the Sandstag Museum in conjunction with Anderson. However, the intervention of the four curators was not immediately evident. For example, one of the larger installations was first encountered on the ground floor. The colourful visual narrative couldn't be discerned until you went to the vantage point of the second floor. There was no direction to visitors to go upstairs to make sense of it, but perhaps the absence of direction was itself a curatorial intervention. The curatorial voice in the exhibition was Laurie Anderson's, perhaps because a number of the installations were actually accompanied by her voice. The oversized books and audio recordings were compelling, including her story of a trip to a Zen retreat in California with her dog Lolabelle. But it was the hologram that grabbed me by the throat, and it wasn't even a real hologram. It was a projection onto very tiny figures of Anderson sitting in a chair with her dog Lolabelle sitting beside her in a similar but smaller chair. Sorry for the resolution. The combination of the simulated hologram and Anderson's voice enthralled me and other viewers. In this exhibition, it was the artist who emerged as a curator. It was Anderson who made the link between the words and the information and what that meant. I just couldn't resist including an image of Laurie Anderson in the red. That's completely irrelevant. The degree of curatorial intervention in each of these exhibitions varied. In the Turner, Bacon and Bourgeois exhibitions, there are curatorial statements presented as wall texts. With the Anderson, I had to make a phone call to Adelaide to find out who curated the exhibition. The style of curation also varied. For Turner and Bourgeois, it was discreet. For Bacon, it was overt and omnipresent. For Anderson, it was the artist who emerged as a curator. Anderson was there with you in the gallery's faces, in voice, in images, and in body as a hologram. Now, the term curation has been central to museum studies for more than a century. But more recently, it's been experiencing growing cultural cachet in a number of other fields of inquiry. And these are the fields I want to talk about today. Marketing, online communication, education, and literacy studies. And I've put marketing first for very good reason. I'm interested in how the term has moved from museum studies to the digital world. Now, in 2010, Elliot von Buskirk, then a writer for Wired, announced that we live in the age of curation. According to Van Buskirk, in this age of digital excess, we're surrounded by too much music, too much software, too many websites, too many feeds, too many people, too many of their opinions, and so on. Curation, he says, is fundamental to the way in which we view the world these days. Facebook curates the web. Evolver FM curates music. news publications such as the Huffington Post curate the news, and consumption devices such as Kindles and iPads curate functionality. I think that von Buskirk is onto something, and in this presentation I explore the discourses surrounding the use of the term, as I think it has serious implications for digital literacy studies. So I want to begin with the term's genealogy, paying particular attention to its rise in museum studies. I then look at how it's used in the 4 fields of inquiry, and then conclude by considering what the analysis means for critical literacy education. Now, early use of curation as a noun suggests healing and taking care of, and it was first used in the 14th century. Curate as a verb means to act as curator of a museum or an exhibit, first used in 1909. More recently, the term's been used to denote the sharing of information by experts and professionals across a range of areas. Curate as a verb has been applied in the context of music festivals, hence Laurie Anderson, and for online use to, quote, select, organise and present suitable content using professional or expert knowledge. Now, although historically interesting, these definitions don't go very far in understanding what curation means today. Raymond Williams' insight that the meaning of words can only be understood as part of relationships and processes of change informs my 2 main questions. What are the discourses and practices associated with curation in digital times, and what are the implications of the various uses, meanings and practices for critical literacy education? My argument here is that an exploration of the discourses associated with curation may provide literacy researchers and teachers with new ways of thinking and talking about critical literacy education today. I've used a critical discourse analysis approach that integrates some ideas from Fairclough, Wodak and Gee. Discourse is understood as a coherent way of making sense of the world or some aspects of it. It's a particular construction or version of reality. Discourses include much more than language. They're ways of behaving, interacting, valuing, thinking, believing, speaking, and often reading and writing that are accepted as parts of particular roles. And CDA is useful because it's analytical, discourse-oriented, and critical. Now, the other key term that requires some explanation is practices. Now, in literacy studies, practices has been broadly understood as regular and sustained socio-cultural activities involving elements of knowledge, identity and being that vary across social settings, resulting in different kinds of engagements with writing and artefacts of literacy. Practices are passed on through interaction and activity, and within them, knowledge is constituted and social life is produced, maintained and changed. Practices are habits, dispositions, routines, customs and traditions that provide an account for how the social order is constrained, reproduced and modified. Now some comments about the application of curation in museum studies, where it's been used for more than 40 years, as traces of its meaning in these fields, the fields of museum and gallery studies, are evident in the reinvented online forms. Curation in a museum involves content specialists who are responsible for an institution's collections and the interpretation of the material. The purpose of curation has traditionally involved tangible objects of some sort, artwork, collectibles, historic items or scientific collections. However, new forms of curation in museums are emerging that involve the preservation, as we know of course, of digital data objects. Understandings of curation and the role of curators in curating exhibitions in museums and galleries began to shift in the late 1960s. And you know that time, that the emergence of postmodern kinds of understandings of the world. The primary discourse began to turn away from the critique of the artwork towards the subject of curating and the role of the curator in exhibitions. By the 1990s, a new discourse about curatorial practice emerged, which emphasised individual practice, the first-person narrative, and curator self-positioning. Now, the relatively recent appearance of the verb to curate in museum studies indicates the growth of discussion around curatorial practice. The curator is no longer just a carer, but someone who has a more creative and active part to play in the production of art. But my point here is that curating as a practice, no matter the context, is always ideological. Now to the 4 fields to look at how curation is used within them. As expected, there's much that's common to them all. First, marketing. This is the one that I really want to give the most emphasis to because it is unbelievably influential. The internet is often held up as a free source of information and services, recalling its origins, but essentially it's commercial in nature. Digital technologies bring with them infinite opportunities for profit making. The presentation of interactive, customised marketing content via digital channels has changed the nature of communication from overt advertising and promotion to individual news, comment, word of mouth, from trusted and credible electronic sources and friends. This is the context in which I want to talk about content curation in online marketing. Now, online business expert Stephen Rosenbaum distinguishes between three main forms of content production on the internet: content creation, content aggregation, and content curation. All three forms can function independently of marketing forces, but they can also involve various modes of marketing, with the borders between them often blurred. Rosenbaum argues that content curation, and he's a businessman and works in the field of marketing, he argues that content curation represents an untapped reservoir for marketers. Understanding how it differs from the other two forms of content production, says Rosenbaum, is important for the industry. Now, content creation involves the development of newsworthy, educational and entertainment material for distribution over the internet. Content creation includes creating a website, posting material to another website. The materials posted for sharing might be photos, artwork, writing or audio and video files. And Wikipedia, of course, is the iconic example of content creation. Content aggregation involves the automatic gathering of links. The computerized processes involved include gathering, organizing, and filtering content. All of these words are really important. RSS is a family of web feed formats used to publish frequently updated works such as blog entries, news headlines, audio and video in a standardized format. Here's the RSS channels for the Sydney Morning Herald. Now, content curation, human filtering and organizing, is a relatively new practice in which people add their work to that of the machines. It's the gathering and dissemination of information utilised by many, from small bloggers to aggregate news giants like the Huffington Post. Of course, all three forms can involve marketing. With content creation, take for example the unabashed use of Wikipedia for self-institutional and corporate promotion. With content aggregation, just simple branding is evidence of marketing activity, as Google News. However, content curation has the most potential for people with something to sell, so says Rosenbaum. Now, in his wonderful book which I've just read, called Curation Nation, such a title, How to Win in a World Where Consumers Are Creators, Stephen Rosenbaum uses a marketing discourse that's not immediately recognisable as such. He presents the emerging model of how people will find, organise, share, and ultimately consume content. He argues that with too much information available, content curators offer internet users help to locate what's worthwhile. He asks rhetorically, who are curators? And remember, his audience is marketing. Who are curators? What can they gather and republish? Do they have the right to get paid for curation? If so, who's adding the real value? Adding value is just absolutely intrinsic to his book. The content makers or the curator publishers? For creators, people who've spent their careers making content and trying to sort out an economic model, curation can seem like an end run around hard work. And so the conflict ultimately comes down to this. Is curation about saving money or about adding value? The answer, it appears, is yes to both. Rosenbaum describes the present era as one of content abundance, in which even prolific curators are inevitably going to mix their creative content with a blend of created sources. For Rosenbaum, creators, distributors, aggregators and curators are all economically essential parts of the value chain. That's the term he uses, the value chain. Content curation is a hot topic amongst online marketers. It sparked polarised debate about some of the issues that we've already started to talk about here, about the difference between content creators and content curators. A fundamental difference between the two is that content creators avoid intellectual property concerns by creating their own content, while content curators aggregate, validate and annotate existing content with its associated intellectual property claims into a repository. Central to the controversy is the question about the ethics of taking, and this is why critical literacy, I hope that you're starting to see the connections, about the ethics of taking the work of content creators and repurposing it. Rosenbaum reassures his readers that advertisers will embrace trusted places of trusted sources. He believes that curation can't exist without creation, so that it's impossible to imagine curators as adding value without a reasonable economic arrangement with content creators. So the ethical issues around attribution, repurposing and editorialising about others' content are far from resolved. Rosenbaum proposes that respect and remuneration be the reasonable starting places. However, that's what the music industry said about Napster and the file-to-file sharing of music, and Napster may have gone bankrupt over copyright issues, but the brand and the practice live on. There seems to be deep resistance by users to pay for certain media resources online, and perhaps this dates back to Berners-Lee's original conception of the web in 1989, in which everything was free. Perhaps it just simply reflects opportunism. Now to my second field, and that's online communication. Online communication emerged as a field of study in the 1960s when US researchers first developed protocols that allowed the sending and receiving of messages via computers. The ARPANET eventually evolved into the internet, which in 2013 brings together about a third of the world's total population. So not everybody is connected. Online communication first became possible in the 1980s following the development and spread of personal computers. Mark Warschauer suggests dividing online communication into two distinct periods. The first one, the introduction of computer-mediated communication and education in the 1980s, and then the second one, the emergence of the World Wide Web in the 90s. But the popularisation of the term Web 2, used in the first decade of the 2000s to describe the transition from static web pages to a more dynamic web, I think represents a third period to add to Warschauer's two. So it's useful to talk about three periods of online communication. Now, social curation is what people do through the use of Web 2. They create, organise, interpret and share pictures, video, music, opinions, and they also curate stuff. The difference between social curation with Web 2 and traditional museum curation is, here it is, scholarship. Now, this is something I hope that we can talk about. The kind of expertise required to study objects and put together an exhibition for cultural and educational purposes is very different to the kind of curation that's going on Web 2. Both are valuable, but the social practice of curation online has created, it's argued, the need for experts to identify the best and most relevant online content for people's different requirements. Online curators, it's said, are people who can separate quality from junk and put it together in creative ways. This is what curators have traditionally done in a museum context, but now the landscape is not only broader, it's very different. Of course, social curation of content is not a new social phenomenon. People have long shared information about media content they've heard on radio, on television, or read in a newspaper or magazine. However, in the online environment, it's much easier to share the digital content, not just to describe it. So on Scoopit, one of the many, many examples of curation software around today, Howard Rheingold, writer, critic, and Web 2 enthusiast, credited with coining the term virtual community and instantly recognisable by his multicoloured jackets, explains curation as an act of self-interest that enriches the commons and benefits everybody. I need to search, scan and select the best resources I can find for my own personal interests, and by making my choices available to others, I create a resource for many besides myself. Curation is also a signal to others who share my interests, people I probably would not have known or known about otherwise, who in turn suggest resources to me. I feed the networks of people who do me the honour of valuing my choices, and they feed me back. It's about knowing, learning, sharing and teaching, all in one. Now, Rheingold identifies the responsibility of educators in this domain, in a world in which people are overwhelmed and inundated by a glut of information. This is what he says. Young people need to learn how to scan, select, decide and deploy information effectively, and know how to use information tools such as search, RSS, dashboards and filters. Social curation has also been described as a metaphor to live by. Hugo Liu, a researcher in the Media Lab at MIT, explains that internet-wide people use the term curation to mean the process of finding, filtering and organising digital artefacts according to their tastes. And this kind of reminded me yesterday, Rodney, when you were talking of this museum of me. In real life, a curator is a vanguard of cultural heritage. Curators oversee museums and institutions. By talking about digital life as curation, we imply that it's an aesthetic project I am the proprietor of the Museum of Me. Curating your online web presence is just a gateway drug. Trust me, it will spread to real life in a big way. The food we eat, the friends we keep, the habits of our day. Now for Mikko Villi, who's an academic in communication at Aalto University in Finland, social curation describes the network distribution of content by adding qualitative judgment and imbuing the content with personal and social significance. Social curation is about people distributing and marketing content in their networks by making personal referrals and guiding their peers to consume content that they consider interesting and relevant. Social curation is involved in the shift from the individualised and personalised content consumption toward consumption as a networked practice. Villi regards social curators as knowledge brokers who interpret, publicise and endorse content so that there's always an aspect of recommendation involved. This links social curation with word-of-mouth communication, but the difference between the two is that social curation is also about distribution, in that access to the internet-based content is often provided with a recommendation. Now, the ideological nature of social curation is demonstrated simply by juxtaposing the views of Reingold, who sees the political possibilities of social curation for transforming cultures and communities, with a website advertising a marketing conference, the Social Curation Summit, in LA in 2012. Look who's speaking, none other than the ubiquitous Stephen Rosenbaum. The conference organisers see value in social curation and the sharing of content, but for commercial purposes. And I don't want to sound as if I'm so hostile completely to commercial purposes. I know that that's the nature of the society that we live in, but in terms of education, it's certainly something that we have to think about. And this was written on the conference website. In the era of tweeting, liking and +1ing, how you share content is often just as important as the content itself. The conference is the must-attend event for everyone focused on the proliferation of visual social networks and the diverse array of content curation services that have drawn the attention of users, investors and brands alike. Harnessing the power of social curation for marketing campaigns, product launches, promotions, events and everyday projects is what Social Curation Summit is all about. Join us as we explore how the social graph is transforming from a network of who knows who into a dynamic interest graph of who knows what, discovered through social curation. Now what's remarkable about marketing is its pervasive influence, evident in the discourses associated with curation in the fields of online communication, education and literacy studies. Now to the third field I want to talk about, and that's education. A common thread, and this is a very limited perspective, but just to give a taste of it, a common thread in educational policy documents, particularly school education, is the development of skills for the 21st century to produce effective citizens in a global economy. The Partnership for 21st Century Skills, a US organisation sponsored by the Education Department and a consortium of corporations and educational organisations, including Apple, Cisco and the National Education Association, is a prime example of this direction. P21 outlines the 21st century skills that must be mastered. Today's graduates need to be critical thinkers, problem solvers and effective communicators who are proficient in both core subjects and new 21st century content and skills. These 21st century skills include learning and thinking skills, information and communications technology, literacy skills and life skills. 21st century skills are in demand for all students no matter what their future plans, and they'll have an enormous impact on students' prospects. I was looking for the word curation in policy documents and didn't find it until I had breakfast with Guy this morning, who said that there's a Singapore document emerging at the moment in which curate, the verb to curate as a skill, something that students have to learn, is number one in their list of what students have to do. So thank you for that, Guy. Although none of the documents examined, as I said, use the term curation, there are many active blogs and sites maintained by educators who draw attention to the important links between curation and 21st century education. The proponents are mainly teacher librarians and other educators, but also marketers of curation software, highlighting the murky border between commercial interests and education. Take, for example, Barbara Bray, a creative learning strategist in California who makes connections between 21st century skills in curation on her website and at the same time promotes Scoopit curation software. A curator pulls together and oversees collections of materials. The internet, Web 2 tools and social media have expanded the traditional role of publisher to almost anyone. The role of curator is changing too. Anyone can curate online, pulling together their own collections. I started and used Scoop.it, Create Your Learning, and now I see why curating is important. When you create a Scoop.it, you put in the tags. Some of my tags are curation, curating, etc. Some academics in education are also using the term curation in their writing. A notable exponent is George Siemens, a Canadian researcher writing on learning, networks and technology digital environments, and he's renowned for creating the first MOOC. So he's a really, really interesting person to look at if you don't know about his work. He describes a curatorial teacher as one who acknowledges the autonomy of learners, yet understands the frustration of exploring unknown territories without a map. A curator is an expert learner. Instead of dispensing knowledge, he creates spaces in which knowledge can be created, explored and connected. While curators understand their field very well, they don't adhere to traditional in-class, teacher-centric power structures. A curator balances the freedom of individual learners with the thoughtful interpretation of the subject being explored. While learners are free to explore, they encounter displays, concepts and artefacts representative of the discipline. Their freedom to explore is unbounded, but when they engage with subject matter, the key concepts of a discipline are transparently reflected through the curatorial actions of the teacher. We could spend the whole session just talking about the discourses here in that quotation. Now finally, and I'm starting almost on the home run, to literacy studies. Now there hasn't been much written about curation, but the notion of curation is absolutely central to John Potter's digital media and learner identity, the new curatorship. Potter is an academic at the Institute of Education in London. He describes his research with young people as they made short video pieces about their lives. The book is informed by the idea that curatorship is a useful metaphor for understanding young people's learning, both in and out of school. New digital media, he argues, provides new contexts for making the self. Immediately, there are connections with Lou's notion of making the self, Lou's notion of curation as a metaphor for the museum of me, and Rosenbaum, back to him again, you can see how he's influenced me, his notion of the curated me as a metaphor for the millennials who have grown up with a 24/7 news cycle and reality TV and who know the power of branding and publicity. Every day they act as their own digital publicists, curating and monitoring the me brand. Now, with the impact of social media, many people have created a profile of some sort, a place to collect favourite videos, moments to share, maintain affiliations with friends, family, a cultural space shaped by new media technology, and as Potter explains, it's quite natural for those who choose and have the means to do so to share a mediated and curated version of their experience when they make, edit and present media texts of various kinds, from the online CV to the photo gallery, from the blog to the YouTube clip, whereas in earlier times, apposite words to describe activities around publication may have been written, edited, produced. It's quite clear that they are inadequate to capture all the self-representational activities and practices in network digital culture. The word curated does so by subsuming all of those practices and adding others that are possible in new media. Now, he defines curatorship as an active cultural and literacy practice in new media with its own ways of reading and writing itself, its own lexis and grammar. Curating is not only about writing and creating, but also about collecting, distributing, assembling and disassembling. All of these activities are part of what people do in new media production, from posting a status in a social networking site through to making a short clip, sharing an online gallery, or any number of other activities. It's about knowing the different forms you are working with work together to make meaning intertextually, and for which purposes and audiences they are successful. Now, borrowings have always been enacted across the arts, but those with access to digital technologies have the opportunity to take and remix content, to publish things they have made alongside things they have created, and to establish new relationships and thus new meanings, but always with consideration of the complex ethical issues associated with using content created by others. These practices, and that's Potter's idea, these practices embody the curatorial nature of lived experience today. Now I'm on the home run, almost finished. what I want to consider very briefly is the implications of curation for critical literacy education, and this is where I become normative unashamedly. The term curation has moved from the museum to online spaces where it's used for the curated self on Facebook, iPod playlists and Flickr, and for curated consumption. That in itself is a whole fascinating area which I haven't even dealt with today. In all the discourse associated with curation, traces of its use in museum studies linger, which suggests that the objects have been chosen and presented by an expert equipped with the appropriate knowledge and experience. But is this always the case? No matter the field of inquiry, the practice of curation is never neutral. As it is always ideological, there are implications for critical literacy education. As active participants in virtual worlds, young people develop their digital literacy practices through different online activities. They learn new social practices as well as applying and extending their existing knowledge to engage with online worlds. It's important that literacy educators develop a deep understanding of how young people learn to negotiate these worlds as the spaces in which they interact are saturated with cultural, political and commercial messages and influences. This is a point that I'm really interested in what people think about this, because I'm not quite sure. Much of the discussion around the use of new media in literacy education has centred on the consumer versus producers debate. It's a bifurcation that I've never found very helpful. Views vary wildly about the number of people who actually produce content, from the 1% rule to many. But it's clear that the producers are far fewer in number than the consumers. A more useful approach might be to describe what people do on the internet in terms of the three categories considered in this paper: content creators, content aggregators, and content curators. It might generate a more nuanced account of the activities in which young people engage in the new media environment and how schools and teachers might use the knowledge to inform literacy teaching and learning. Now, all three are important, but the one literacy educators know least about is curation. It's a complex term understood differently in different discourse communities. When broadly applied, curating suggests the functions of editing, aggregating, organising, culling, directing, or conducting. But it can also involve trying, testing new attitudes, rethinking and pushing boundaries. Literacy educators need to develop strategies to raise young people's critical awareness of the various forms of curation evident online so that they can become more informed critical users of online spaces. And just as the degree of curatorial intervention in each of the 4 exhibitions with which I began this presentation varied, so does the extent of the active practice of curation on the web vary amongst users. So the challenge for teachers becomes, how do we build these new understandings in our literacy classrooms? How do we encourage our students to engage actively, creatively and critically with new media and with legacy media in these changing times? In other words, how do we encourage our students to engage actively, creatively and critically with all media in the age of curation?
Thank you for that wonderful talk. I think we're going to hold our questions for the discussion section after the next presentation, but first we'll take a break. So I think those will be set up in the end of the hallway there. See you 30 minutes.
I'm sorry I read it. But if I would pick a 5-minute view, you need to come to go. I wouldn't have much
So